And now we will go to Brian Fauteux and Brianne Selman, who are primary investigators and secondary investigators for the Cultural Capital Project.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks, committee, for hearing us today. We know that the committee has a genuine interest in providing livelihoods to Canadian creators. The spirit of our submission is to caution that in an industry characterized by market consolidation and an imbalance of power between artists and the big business of labels, proposals for legislation that do not address this imbalance may in the long term worsen the conditions for those at the bottom. Artists are not always the rights holders, and legislation from rights holders does not inherently help artists. So our submission comes from a research team that includes myself, Assistant Professor of Music at the University of Alberta, Brianne Selman, who will take the questions after, Scholarly Communications and Copyright Librarian at the University of Winnipeg, and Dr. Andrew DeWard, PhD in Cinema and Media Studies at UCLA, and two research assistants, Dan Calusi and William Northledge. As mentioned, we're working on a SSHRC Insight Grant-funded project titled the Cultural Capital Project, Digital Stewardship and Sustainable Monetization for Canadian Independent Musicians. And we're looking at issues of fair payment for creators, as well as ways to encourage new and creative artistic production. We aim to represent here today everyday users and smaller scale creators and hope to provide a diversity of position. Everyone, of course, comes before this committee to argue in what they might perceive to be their own self-interest. And as great as the achievements are of any of the media industries you have heard from so far, their success is based on the creativity of artists who are themselves users of creative goods. Copyright creates and maintains monopolies by creating exclusive rights that can only be exploited by the rights holder. But from its inception, copyright law has always also included limits to those monopolies, in order to achieve a balance with the interests of the general public and to provide access to the public good of culture and knowledge. And copyright has been effective at building assets for powerful oligopolies. Canadian musicians and users are at the mercy of non-Canadian media and tech companies. Universal, Sony, and Warner control roughly 86% of the North American recording and publishing market. Live Nation and AEG monopolizes the live concert and ticketing business. iHeartMedia and Cumulus have acquired the majority of terrestrial radio stations. SiriusXM dictates the satellite radio market, and as you might know, just recently purchased Pandora. And Apple, Google, Amazon, and Netflix and Spotify have come to dominate the digital media, streaming media sector. And there is stunning inequality among musicians, and it's getting worse. The top 1% of artists account for 77% of all recorded music income, while 10 top-selling tracks command 82% more of the market and are played almost twice as much on top 40 radio than they were a decade ago. It is more winner-take-all in the music industries than ever before, and we need to ensure that the middle class of creators have the means to earn a living. Massive profits are being made in the media landscape, little of which makes its way to artists and performers. A recent Citigroup report found that the U.S. music industry generated $43 billion last year, but artists only received 12%. Much artist revenue has to be sustained by aggressive touring, an option only open to a few, and one that is difficult given Canada's vast geographical area. This market consolidation, combined with vertical integration where tour promoters are owned by radio stations, are owned by record labels, makes it harder for both creators and users to be exposed to diverse, vibrant, and remunerated cultural goods. We wonder then what other artist protection provisions might exist and be of benefit to Canadian creators. Like the EU, which is pushing back against the American tech oligopoly with fines and legislation, it is worth considering antitrust solutions that challenge this market domination, or at the very least, maintain space for new entrants into the market. We support recommendations that aim to enable creators to have more control over their creations and their profits. We recognize that the many industry representatives are in favor of a copyright term extension from author's life plus 50 to 70 years. We support efforts to make the lives of working musicians more financially viable. However, we caution against having this term extension dominate the narrative of this review, and we would encourage a careful consideration of rights reversions as a way to mitigate the ill effects of extension. Recently, Brian Adams argued for rights reversions with the ability of creators to reclaim ownership of creations 25 years after they have been given away. This suggestion is one that does offer some balance to the historically imbalanced relationship between artists and labels, where creators are often pressured to sign away their rights for life. Term extensions do not hold up to scrutiny in cultural economic theory. Most of the commercial value of a sound recording is extracted in the first 10 years, so 70 years after death provides no real additional incentive. Furthermore, it prevents a more vital public sphere to the benefit of major record labels who get to further exploit an artist's work after their death. Indeed, studies show that older works in the public domain enjoy greater commercialization than similar titles with restricted rights. Key to creators being able to exercise these rights, and others already granted by the Copyright Act, is clarification that these rights cannot be contracted away. Record labels, publishers, and platforms should not be able to add contractual stipulations that override things like creators' moral rights or a hypothetical reversion right. We agree that public funding is and always has been crucial for independent Canadian creators, but we are extremely wary of this burden falling on users in the form of a smartphone tax. The variety of uses for these devices are numerous, and the vast majority of these uses are going to be for necessary connectivity, not piracy-related activities at all. Copyright reform should not place unnecessary limits on users and artists' freedom in an effort to remedy the financial issues that have come from an imbalance of power in the media industries. Instead, we encourage efforts to provide artists with higher payout rates via streaming and online music services. We caution against the technological optimism shown in the recent EU copyright changes, which encourages the enforcement of copyright law by technological algorithm, which is an incredibly blunt instrument to apply to the general public. The additional costs of overly aggressive regimes of copyright enforcement provide ever greater barriers and costs for new entrants into the market. The recent example of Sony trying to require takedown of all recordings of Bach is a good one for showing how expanding notice and notice into a regime where companies can unilaterally request takedown of content could have a significant harmful effect on the public. Small creators would unfairly feel the burden of this blunt style of regulation. When it comes to designing a balanced copyright system, there is no need to use a hammer when we can cut like a knife. We wish to end by restating that a concentration of power creates power imbalances that require solutions that extend beyond those that benefit the rights holder, and we sincerely thank the committee for taking the time to hear us today.
It's important to remember that we don't have much time, so I'm going to ask you a very brief question. Mr. Fauteux, last week I want to say that we heard from Mr. Bussard from the RAM, Regroupement des Artistes de Musicaux, and that group distributed to us 29 recommendations. And the first 11, which I think were in the first act, were measures to be applied immediately, and or rather the first thrust. So number 2 were to rebuild the system to put creators at its center. So may I ask you to consider that one of the things, given that you are seeing things from the perspective of the creator or the creative industry, and because that's the very source of things, so would it be possible to believe that it is unjust to think that a world publishing house or a world recording house made some kind of mysterious or bizarre deal that gives micro pennies to each of these platforms? In 1 minute, please.
Is that as certainly the way these things are distributed seems fairly unfair and unjust. And I think we find with market consolidation that they get even more so unjust. That's the biggest change that I think that we've seen in the last 40 years, as the earlier question was, that it's essentially become a system of monopoly. And I would remind the government that there are options for dealing with monopolies that don't necessarily exist in the Copyright Act, which is a very broad general thing, but there are specific ways to deal with that. And historically, our antitrust approaches have focused on price fixing, but I think that it's far more concerning at this point in time to look at how large monopolies are able to exert their bargaining power over the individual creators.
Okay.
And certainly as the market consolidates, they have more and more and more bargaining power because there are fewer and fewer other avenues. I think that is one area that the Copyright Act can protect, though, by not over-regulating for new entrants.
Thank you very much. I'm asking you the question here because I think that we shall...
You know, to Mr. Reed's point, it's not only one of the most important things. In some respect, what artists do for this country is the most important thing. MIT did a really interesting analysis of all the media that we've ever produced, everything we've ever done as a country, and how we are seen in the eyes of the rest of the world. All of our famous politicians, all of our famous generals, all of our famous scientists. And the top 10 list is artists. So in the eyes of the world, Canada is art. And Canadians are artists. That tells you whose corner I'm in when I sit at this committee. I used to be parliamentary secretary to the committee at the beginning of the mandate, and now I'm here as a member with a voice. I'm going to use it. Et à mon collègue, Monsieur Blaney, on a...
And to my colleague, Mr. Blaney, we're not trying to play for time. We're trying to do a good job with the time that we have to have a proper vision of the Copyright Act. That being said...
And so streaming, it sounds to me like we went from the wonder of the web to the tyranny of the technology. And I did some math, and for an artist to have $2,400 a month, which is minimum wage in Alberta right now at $15 an hour, on YouTube it's 16.5 million hits, and on Spotify it's 9.8 million hits each month to get $2,400. That doesn't make sense. So to everybody, because I'm a business person and I want to know where the money is going to come from, because we got to get money in the pockets of artists so they can keep producing. That's what you need. Ecosystems need things. They need nutrients, they need sun, they need water, they need oxygen. Pick whichever one of those money makes for you. For an artist, clearly they need more. So I want to ask a question for each of you. Do we make the pie bigger, or are we simply talking about cutting the pie differently? And if so, what does that look like? And you have literally a minute each. So, Brianne, first to you.
I think, sort of to speak to some earlier questions too, incentive and reward are frequent frameworks that we talk about when we talk about any sort of economic production. And that's why some of our suggestions have focused on the lack of incentive. There is no incentive upfront to artists to extend term to 70 years after death. It really doesn't work that way because they're often not the rights holders of their music. But a rights reversion offers a real incentive to artists, especially because when we're talking about musical acts from 1993, you don't know the future value of that music. You can't predict that. There's a value gap in our time. So we don't think in terms of 70 years after our death most of the time. So immediate rewards or closer term rewards, such as a rights reversion. And just to clarify, I think there is some confusion. Ownership of rights reversion doesn't necessarily exclude an actual term exception, or a term extension rather. They can exist. So rights reversion can still exist within the Berne Convention and does in the US. And okay. Just to say that the rights reversion in the US clearly doesn't act as a disincentive for cultural works being provided there. So I think that we really need to actually analyze these things like incentive and reward and see who's getting the incentive and who's getting the reward.
Thank you. Dr. Fauteux, we share an alma mater. You're teaching now where I went to school. So do we make the pie bigger? Do we chart it? Do we cut it up differently? Where does the money come from?
Well, actually, since I read the submission, I've been giving my time to Brianne for the questions. So would you like me to give...
Sure, keep going.
If you have anything else to add.
Certainly, I would argue for a redistribution of the existing pie. I think that there is a vast amount of money that's being made. We're talking about billions of dollars, and we are not seeing it in the hands of artists. I think that approaches that count on the benevolence of business to pass it on and if there is a sudden windfall don't reflect the realities of the current market, which is we're seeing a shallower market. So we're seeing the promotion of giant stars with very limited investment in anything in the middle and in the deeps. And that's going to hurt Canada as well, specifically because, of course, we sort of have a lot of novelty acts or really interesting little quirky things that don't necessarily read as they're going to be big star power at the outset, but then surprise the world with what we come up with. So I think that we really need to think about a distribution that is deeper.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Madame Rioux and then to Jackie and Alan with some questions about